Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I resume the 47th meeting of the 46th session of the Human Rights Council. We shall now begin consideration of draft proposals tabled at this session. I remind you that the voting process is a members-only process. Observer states may intervene in only two instances: at the stage of introduction of a draft proposal, or if the observer state is a country concerned by a draft resolution or decision. Apart from these two instances, observer states will not be in a position to take the floor until the voting process is completed, not even on a point of order. The Secretariat has verified that all representatives of the state members of the Council wishing to take part in the voting process, as well as observer states introducing draft proposals and concerned countries that would speak under item 2, are present in the Zoom meeting. The meeting has been locked, and we can now begin taking action. We will follow the extraordinary modalities for electronic voting that were adopted by the Council on the 18th of March 2021. Allow me to recall that a test vote using the e-recorded votes module on the e-delegate platform will be conducted at the beginning of each meeting before the Council starts taking action on draft proposals.
Tu veux que je fasse le vote ou tu le fais? Fais-le si tu veux, Emmanuel.
Once this test vote is completed, we will proceed with the consideration of draft proposals in the chronological order of agenda items. Within each agenda item, we will act upon draft texts in the order of their submission. I will inform you when a text is not ready for action. As President of this Council, I will try, to the greatest extent possible, to grant the time necessary to concerned parties to undertake negotiations on draft texts in order for them to be adopted by consensus. The voting process would proceed via the Zoom platform in the same manner as it used to be in Room 20. Main sponsors of draft proposals would introduce their texts via Zoom or pre-recorded video messages, and members of the Council would also participate via Zoom or pre-recorded video messages to make general comments and explanations of vote before the vote. May I remind you, and this is very important, that in accordance with our voting process, all procedural motions, such as oral amendments, no action motions, and requests for votes on separate paragraphs, should be announced during the general comments segment. If this is not the case, and a procedural motion is raised when the vote has started with explanation of vote, the motion will be deemed inadmissible. Please do bear this in mind. Should any state member of the Council wish to make a procedural motion as part of general comments, the representative of that state will be able to do so by 1, pressing the raise hand button, 2, indicating the motion in the chat box, and 3, putting their camera on and raising their hands. I also remind you that explanations of vote and general comments after the vote will be allowed only after the action has been taken on all draft proposals under a specific agenda item. I would also like to remind you that in accordance with Rule 128 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly, the sponsor of a draft proposal or an amendment is not permitted to explain his or her vote or her proposal or amendment. Finally, the speaking time during the voting process is 3 minutes for all, including concerned countries. If more than one delegation is introducing a draft proposal, this speaking time should be shared between them. Should there be a request for a vote on a specific draft proposal, I will ask the Secretariat to activate the vote on that draft proposal on the e-delegate platform. For security reasons, the system may periodically log representatives of the states members of the Council out of the e-delegate platform. Therefore, before opening the vote on any draft proposal, where there has been a request for a vote, I will ask representatives to log out and log in again. Once I ask the Secretariat to activate the vote on a draft proposal, representatives would then see the specific draft proposal appear on the e-recorded votes module of the e-delegate platform, upon which they will be able to electronically cast their vote on that specific draft proposal. Representatives may also need to refresh the page by clicking on the refresh button in order for that specific draft proposal to appear on their screen. I will proceed slowly with a vote in order to allow all states members of the Council to have ample time to cast their vote. Should there be more than one representative from a state member of the Council connected to the e-delegate platform and casting a vote for that state, the platform would reflect the last vote cast by a representative of that state. Representatives would be able to change or delete their votes so long as the vote remains open. Once all states members of the Council present and voting have cast their votes and checked that their votes are accurately reflected on the e-delegate platform, I would ask the Secretariat to close the vote on the specific draft proposal. Once the voting is closed, representatives will no longer be able to change or delete their vote. A hotline will be in operation throughout the process in case representatives have difficulties communicating via Zoom, any technical issue they are facing. The hotline number is 022 917 7573. And I'll read it again, 022 917 7573. I wish to now request states members of the Council to now log in with their usual credentials on e-delegate and to go to the e-recorded votes module on the platform following the guidelines that were recirculated by the Secretariat yesterday afternoon. If you are already logged in on the platform, for the reasons I explained earlier, please log out and log in again. If all representatives are now logged in, I will ask the Secretariat to open the test vote on L0. I invite all states members of the Council to cast their vote. Can I ask all States members of the Council to cast their vote, please? I see that all representatives have now cast their vote. Please verify that your vote is accurately reflected on the Zoom screen. If any representative is facing a technical issue, this is the moment that you should tell us about the difficulty that you are facing. I see no hands raised. I therefore ask the Secretariat to close the test vote. Ladies and gentlemen, having successfully completed the test vote, we will now begin consideration of draft proposals. You can now see on the Zoom screen the list of draft proposals ready for action today, and almost all the PBIs have been posted on the HRC extranet. The Council will now consider draft resolution L1 Rev 1, entitled Promoting Reconciliation, Accountability and Human Rights in Sri Lanka. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom to introduce the draft text. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. The United Kingdom has the honour to present draft resolution L1 Rev 1 on behalf of a core group, also comprising Canada, Germany, Malawi, Montenegro and North Macedonia. Madam President, this Council has sought to promote reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka for almost 10 years. It was to Sri Lanka's great credit that between 2015 and 2019, it agreed to a consensual framework to address the legacy of several decades of devastating conflict. The 2015 framework followed a detailed report by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which concluded that large-scale violations and abuses of human rights by all parties had occurred. Sri Lanka's commitments to the Council were ambitious, but these recognized that the only way to bring reconciliation, to heal the suffering of the many victims, and to avoid a recurrence of such violations was to engage with the UN's findings. It was therefore a source of profound regret when Sri Lanka withdrew its support for the 2015 framework last year. Since then, the core group has encouraged a new cooperative framework with Sri Lanka, but unfortunately to no avail. This resolution responds to the High Commissioner's most recent report. It acknowledges progress where this has been made. It also reflects the High Commissioner's findings that the human rights situation has deteriorated, with particular concerns for human rights defenders in civil society space and members of different ethnic and religious communities, including Tamils, Muslims, and Christians. Independent institutions have been weakened, and impunity has become more entrenched as progress in emblematic cases has stalled. Some of those who had sought to pursue justice and advance accountability through the national courts have found themselves persecuted, and in one case, imprisoned, while others who were convicted or suspected of large-scale violations have been pardoned and promoted. Madam President, this resolution and this core group is not anti-Sri Lanka. We are friends of Sri Lanka and its people. We bring this resolution in the hope that it will help advance the human rights of all communities, including Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Sinhala, or Tamil. And most importantly, that it will help prevent the recurrence of past grave violations, which the High Commissioner's report warns this Council about in such clear terms. We regret that agreement could not be reached with Sri Lanka during the 4 informal meetings on the draft resolution, but we thank the distinguished Ambassador of Sri Lanka for his participation. Nonetheless, we believe this constructive and balanced text provides the best framework to support justice and lasting reconciliation and address the most critical human rights challenges. We call on all members of this Council to support this resolution. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I have been informed by the Secretariat that there is one additional co-sponsor. I now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to make general comments. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU member states that are members of the Human Rights Council. This general comment has been agreed by the EU as a whole. We thank the cross-regional group for presenting this very balanced resolution. Reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka have been considered in the Human Rights Council for many years, including through consensual resolutions in previous years. The EU regrets that the government of Sri Lanka has withdrawn its support to these resolutions. We are concerned about a setback of the important gains made. It is key that the Human Rights Council signals the international community's continued support for post-conflict reconciliation and accountability in Sri Lanka. This resolution is also important given the warning signs of a deteriorating human rights situation, including erosion of democratic checks and balances, rise of exclusionary rhetoric, intensified surveillance and intimidation of CSOs, human rights defenders and victims, as well as discrimination of persons belonging to religious and ethnic minority communities. The EU is deeply concerned about these developments. We call on the government of Sri Lanka to continue to promote reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka, including through cooperation on this resolution. For the above-mentioned reasons, the EU supports Resolution L1/Rev1 and hopes it will be adopted by this Council by consensus. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines.
Thank you, Madam President. The Philippines engaged actively in the consultations on this draft resolution. We are disappointed that the pen holders did not take on board in a balanced manner the perspectives and positions of Sri Lanka. We note that Sri Lanka engaged in the informals in good faith, even after the failure of the OHCHR to adhere to high standards of transparency, objectivity, and fairness in reporting. We regret that the pen holders repeated this failure and did not take the opportunity to promote the consultations as a platform to uphold these principles and maintain a discourse based on reason. 3 things are clear in this resolution. First, it pursues a political agenda that is blind to reason and methods of reasoning. Second, the mandate given to the OHCHR will require a budget of $2.8 billion, mostly for salaries of 12 new hires. We regret the late posting of this information, and in this regard, we call on the Council to examine this practice that relegates the budget and the other practical implications of a resolution as an afterthought rather than factors in our decision-making as they should be. Third, this mandate is contemplated against a possible non-cooperation of Sri Lanka, and therefore resources are likely to go to waste if our benchmark is effective action and impact on the ground. Madam President, the rest of the elements of this draft resolution are sketchy and unmoored, particularly its vision of a role for the OHCHR in collecting evidence and developing strategies for future accountability processes. These usurp the role of the state as duty bearer. While recognizing that no country has a perfect record on human rights, the Philippines has appreciated that the government of Sri Lanka has pursued reconciliation, accountability, and human rights through inclusive domestic processes. This is despite severe challenges in its resources and post-conflict security situation. There is no merit in actions by the Council that disrespect these national processes and are driven by simplistic generalizations of complex conditions on the ground. Many of us in Geneva are sheltered from the actual experience of terrorism, conflict, and socioeconomic challenges that are everyday realities to Sri Lanka's 21 million people. This is a handicap that prevents some council members from being more sober in their judgments about the situation in Sri Lanka and from flexing the powers of the council more wisely. Madam President, the Philippines will vote no on this resolution, and we ask other council members to apply wisdom, responsibility, and sobriety on this matter and do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. And are there any other delegations who wish to make general comments? I see none, and we shall now hear from the concerned country. I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Madam President, it is deeply regrettable that a group of countries has tabled a country-specific resolution against Sri Lanka in spite of Sri Lanka's consistent and constructive engagement with the Human Rights Council and with the proponents of the resolution themselves. Sri Lanka considers the draft resolution to be unwarranted, unjustified, and in violation of the relevant articles of the United Nations Charter, in particular, Article 2, subsection 7, and relevant sections of the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 60/251 that provides for the mandate of the Human Rights Council. It is based on the rejected report of the OHCHR on Sri Lanka, which was tabled at this session, and which violates the principles of sovereign equality of all states and non-interference in internal affairs. The resolution is presented without the consent of Sri Lanka as the country concerned and is therefore unhelpful and divisive. No country has a greater interest in bringing about reconciliation among its peoples than the country concerned, a point that has repeatedly been emphasized during the proceedings of this council. The list of co-sponsors of the resolution amply demonstrates the divisive nature of this resolution. Madam President, Sri Lanka categorically rejects the unprecedented proposal in OP 6 of this resolution to expand the role of the OHCHR. This is a dangerous precedent and will have wide-ranging implications for all countries. All members of this council will agree that this body cannot assume tasks not assigned to it by the UN General Assembly in Resolution 60/251 or in subsequent resolutions. In addition, I cannot emphasize enough the dangers posed to all nations, particularly those of the Global South, by the trajectory taken in this resolution, which is urging action on the basis of emerging trends and warning signs, that is, events that have not yet happened. In this context, it is highly regrettable that the draft resolution that has been presented today appears to have ignored all these reservations and concerns. Against this background, I call upon all members of this council to objectively assess whether Sri Lanka represents a situation that warrants the financial and human resources and the urgent attention of this council in this exaggerated and polarized manner at a time of severe financial constraints indicated by the Secretariat. Over $2.8 million is the estimated cost of this exercise, and over a dozen new staff members are to be recruited according to the PBI. Madam President, notwithstanding the stated objectives of the proponents of the resolution, Sri Lanka is of the view that this resolution will polarize Sri Lankan society and adversely affect economic development, peace, and harmony. For all the above reasons, Sri Lanka rejects this draft resolution and requests the members of this council to reject this resolution by a vote. Thank you.
Thank you. I have been informed by the Secretariat that there are PBIs in the amount of $2,856,300, and copies of the statement were posted on the extranet. I now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to make explanations of votes before the vote on the draft proposal. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Madam President, China commends the Sri Lanka government for its commitment to promoting and protecting human rights, promoting sustainable economic and social development, improving people's living standards, safeguarding the rights of vulnerable groups, promoting national reconciliation and combating terrorism. We congratulate the Sri Lanka government on its achievements in these areas. According to GA Resolution 60/251, the work of the HRC should follow the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. All parties should promote and protect human rights through genuine dialogue and cooperation, and refrain from double standards and politicizing human rights issues. We advocate that all countries should observe the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, respect the sovereignty and independence of other countries, and abandon the practice of interfering in other countries' internal affairs, undermining other countries' sovereignty and international cooperation under the pretext of human rights. The sponsors of draft resolution L1 Rev 1 disregards the efforts and achievements by the Sri Lanka government to promote and protect human rights, ignores the wishes of the Sri Lanka people, and interferes in Sri Lanka's internal affairs under the guise of human rights, and disrupts the excellent situation of Sri Lanka's development and stability. This doesn't help to promote and protect human rights. Rather, it's a typical example of politicizing human rights. The HRC should not facilitate this dangerous trend. To safeguard the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the principles established in GA Resolution 60/251, China requests a vote on draft resolution L1 Rev 1 and will vote against it. We call on the HRC members to jointly vote against this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Recognizes the need for improvement regarding the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, as well as the need for further efforts towards national reconciliation in the country. At the same time, Japan takes note of the actions taken by Sri Lanka, such as the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry to investigate past cases of human rights violations, and the payment of reparations amounting to 142 million rupees during 2020. In order to achieve national reconciliation and improvement of the human rights situation, it is critical for Sri Lanka to implement its own initiatives. To this end, Japan has supported Sri Lanka, including through dispatching our experts to the country. Japan hopes the international community will encourage and support Sri Lanka's efforts. For the above reasons, Japan will abstain from voting on this draft resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. Pakistan has always advocated dialogue and engagement as preferred means to advance respect for and to resolve concerns around human rights. Consent of and cooperation with the country concerned are essential ingredients in support of national efforts to promote compliance with human rights obligations. We appreciate Sri Lanka's constructive engagement throughout the informal consultation on the draft resolution before the Council. The Sri Lankan delegation made proposals to align the draft text with its national action plans on reconciliation and accountability, including through empowerment of Commission of Inquiry as well as offices on missing persons and reparations. We regret rejection of these proposals. Ignoring these suggestions were a missed opportunity to secure national ownership of the draft resolution in line with aspirations of the Sri Lankan people. Madam President, during the course of informal consultations, Sri Lanka and a number of other delegations had explained that operative paras 5 and 6 of the draft text lacked balance, proportionality, and inconsistency. For example, preambular paras 4 and 11 of the text reaffirm the sovereignty of Sri Lanka and welcome its continued engagement with the UN and its human rights mechanisms. However, these provisions are at complete variance with the legally untenable external accountability mechanism. We note that such provisions are neither grounded in nor are drawn from the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, the founding UNGA Resolution 60/251, and the IB package. Similarly, Operative Para 7 seeks to expand the scope and the context of 12 years long Sri Lanka's engagement with the Council. We note that the original process that was rooted in promoting reconciliation and accountability in the context of civil war in 2009 is now incompatible with the approach and contents of the draft resolution before the Council. Madam President, each country, including the sponsors of this resolution, have human rights challenges on which there may be diversity of views, interpretations, and solutions depending upon national context and circumstances. Having said that, we have seen media reports related to concerns over burials during the COVID-19 pandemic. We appreciate the steps taken by Sri Lankan government to address these concerns, and we encourage Sri Lanka to continue such steps to preserve the pluralistic fabric of the society where people of different faiths have been living in harmony for centuries. Madam President, the estimated PBIs of $2.8 million for the annual implementation of OP6 also raises serious questions about the equitable utilization of regular budget, especially when the OHCHR and the Council are facing serious liquidity crisis. Deployment of 13 posts in OHCHR on Sri Lanka, nearly the size of a branch, can hardly be justified when OHCHR is faced with serious financial crunch. We request this OHCHR for a breakdown of PBIs and share information on how the financial resources would be arranged for this mandate without compromising other mandated activities from the regular budget. Resort to extra budgetary resources or voluntary contributions would undermine the transparency, impartiality, and credibility of the whole process. Madam President, draft resolution also fails to acknowledge the long struggle of the Sri Lankan people and government against LTTE, an internationally recognized terrorist organization. The horrendous terrorist activities by this organization, aided, abetted, and financed externally, had resulted in the loss of innocent lives and depriving the people of Sri Lanka from their basic rights and freedoms. The draft resolution fails to condemn these crimes unequivocally and shies away from a call for accountability of the LTTE and its sponsors and financiers. Unfortunately, the draft resolution appears to rekindle the sufferings rather than healing the wounds of the people of Sri Lanka. Madam President, in view of these reasons, Pakistan delegation would call the resolution to a vote and vote against it. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
President, Venezuela reiterates its opposition to the selective practice wielded by some countries who are members of this council, who for purely political grounds table initiatives such as this draft resolution L1/Rev1 against the Socialist Democratic Republic of Sri Lanka. Such initiatives do not enjoy the assent of the country concerned, and they violate the principles of respect for sovereignty and non-interference in the domestic affairs of states. We are deeply troubled that the text of the draft resolution seeks to establish the competency of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to collate criminal evidence for future judicial processes, turning it into an organ of a body of criminal inquiry, a flagrant violation of the mandate contained in Resolution 48141 of the General Assembly, which established the OHCHR in the first place. We are also deeply alarmed by the distortion of the preventive approach as a concept, preventive in terms of human rights, that is, a distorted and perverted interpretation of that goal, which is further embedded in this antagonistic initiative against Sri Lanka, which seeks in advance of any concrete findings to disproportionately punish alleged violations of human rights, violations which never took place. It is regrettable that the sponsors of draft resolution L1/Rev1 seem to have ignored the major efforts undertaken by the government of Sri Lanka to comply with its commitments in terms of human rights and to do so since the restoration of peace in 2009. President, Venezuela rejects as baseless the interventionist attempts underway into the internal process being experienced by this country towards true national reconciliation. We'd like to flag the major risk inherent in biased draft resolutions, which follow an interventionist model such as this one. This practice is a throwback to the anachronistic practices and selective proceedings which some major powers and their allies seek to impose, an assault on independence and sovereignty of the countries of the global south, particularly those countries that will not bow the knee to the whims of these global powers. We condemn the selective nature, the politicization, and the blatant double standards in these initiatives, which establish hostile mandates at the behest of those who seek to uphold murky interests of their own. Some governments of the countries which have promoted these draft resolutions have themselves committed and are still committing serious human rights violations, yet they themselves have never been the subject of similar initiatives. Sri Lanka is cooperating actively with this council and its mechanisms and with the OHCHR, demonstrating major headway made in the promotion and protection of the human rights of its people. This draft resolution is entirely unwarranted, for which reason it should be rejected by the members of the Security Council, and we call upon them all to vote against it. For all of the aforementioned reasons, Venezuela energetically and categorically opposes draft resolution L1 Rev 1, and we will vote against. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. The Russian delegation once again reaffirms its position about the fact that it is not acceptable for the Council to consider politicized country resolutions. Experience has shown that these rarely improve the situation of human rights on the ground. On the contrary, they tend to drive the state concerned away from constructive cooperation with international human rights mechanisms. A clear example of this is the draft resolution on promoting reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka. Instead of trying to support the country's delegation and encourage it to engage in dialogue, the sponsors of the draft resolution have preferred to continue using a former practice of making allegations against it. This draft resolution does not reflect balance or objectivity. Therefore, the Russian Federation will vote against this draft resolution, and we call on other states, members of the HRC, to follow suit. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. The Human Rights Council should prioritize cooperation and constructive and respectful dialogue. And universal mechanisms such as the UPR should be used as the sole guarantee of ensuring that we fairly and not on a selective basis address human rights issues and concerns. The resolution before us currently does not enjoy the support of Sri Lanka. The government of this country has provided clear and convincing and abundant proof on its position with regard to this resolution, and that should be respected. For that reason, that draft resolution will only further serve the ends of politicization, bias, and double standards which have crept into this forum and which should be decried. We agree with the opinion and the concerns that have been flagged by previous speakers about the prevention component contained within this draft resolution. And we're also concerned about the mandate that we are seeking to confer upon the OHCHR if we adopt this resolution, calling upon them or granting them the right to compile evidence as a precursor to future trials. Cuba will continue to uphold the basic principles of cooperation, dialogue, and exchange between all countries, and to do so on the basis of the content of the United Nations Charter. President, we reject this draft resolution. It does not refer to issues related to the PBI that will be entailed by its adoption. There's certainly not been enough discussion on the imputed PBIs. For all of these reasons, we will vote against this resolution.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Madam President, India believes in the primary responsibility of the states for the promotion and protection of human rights and constructive international dialogue and cooperation guided by the principles and purposes of the UN Charter in support of such efforts. As an immediate neighbor, India has contributed to the relief, resettlement, rehabilitation, and reconstruction process in Sri Lanka after 2009. Our development assistance has focused on the restoration of livelihoods and economic revival, especially in Sri Lanka's northern and eastern provinces. Madam President, India's approach to the question of human rights in Sri Lanka is guided by two fundamental considerations. One is a support to the Tamils of Sri Lanka for equality, justice, dignity, and peace. The other is in ensuring the unity, stability, and territorial integrity of Sri Lanka. We have always believed that these two goals are mutually supportive, and Sri Lanka's progress is best assured by simultaneously addressing both objectives. India supports the call by the international community for the government of Sri Lanka to fulfill its commitments on the devolution of political authority, including through the early holding of elections for provincial councils, and to ensure that all provincial councils are able to operate effectively in accordance with the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution. At the same time, we believe that the work of OHCHR should be in conformity with the mandate given by the relevant resolutions of the UN General Assembly. We would urge that the government of Sri Lanka carries forward the process of reconciliation, address the aspirations of Tamil community, and continues to engage constructively with the international community to ensure that the fundamental freedoms and human rights of all its citizens are fully protected. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil for a video statement.
Madam President, Brazil thanks the core group for presenting the draft resolution on Sri Lanka. We commend the participation of the Sri Lankan ambassador during the informal consultations as a proof of goodwill, which certainly contributed to a more open and balanced approach during the discussions. We regret that in the end, the Sri Lankan mission decided to dissociate from the process due to different perspectives that could not be accommodated by the core group. In our view, those differences are not irreconcilable, however. While we acknowledge that progress was achieved on the ground in Sri Lanka, we understand that the situation of the country remains of interest to this Council. The Council needs to bear in mind the risk of new episodes of violence and intolerance related to religion or ethnicity. It can support local authorities to foster, to the extent possible, a meaningful and sustained process of promotion of reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in the country. On the other hand, Brazil firmly believes the engagement and cooperation of the concerned country is key to the success of the initiative. While we encourage Sri Lanka to continue to cooperate in good faith, we stress the government's legitimate concerns regarding key issues. Firstly, it did not come unnoticed that some of the recommendations in the office's report presented to the Council might have overstepped the mandate of a body that does not deal with peace and security issues within the UN system. Secondly, evidence relating to violations and abuses of human rights can only result from impartial, transparent, and thorough investigations. Prejudgments and politically motivated accusations must be kept at bay. We also share concerns expressed by some delegations during consultations on the implications of OP6. It requests certain measures to be taken by the office without the establishment of an international accountability mechanism, which would have been the common practice. With the above-mentioned considerations, Brazil will vote in favor of draft resolution 46/L.1 Rev 1 on Sri Lanka. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bolivia.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, President. As this is the first time that I am taking the floor, I'd like to take this opportunity to express my government's commitment to ensuring this Council can work towards the proper protection and promotion of human rights. Bolivia rekindled democracy in 2020. The interpreter apologizes, but the sound does not allow for interpretation, and we do not have the statement.
A los derechos humanos, condenados por varios países, instituciones y organizaciones alrededor del mundo. Hoy Bolivia ha dado el ejemplo al mundo de que es posible recuperar la estabilidad de un país sin injerencia de ningún tipo. Sobre el tema en discusión, pongo en conocimiento que Bolivia no ha cambiado de posición sobre los mandatos específicos contra los países, porque violan los principios universales del respeto a la integridad, la soberanía y la no injerencia.
We do not accept that human rights are used as a political tool. Therefore, we will vote against this resolution. At the same time, we reaffirm that it is necessary to fight against impunity and ensure access to justice and effective remedy for the victims.
A reforzar su compromiso con el proceso de reconciliación nacional. Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you. Are there any other requests for explanation of vote before the vote? I see none. At the request of the delegations of China and Pakistan, the Council will now proceed to a recorded vote on draft proposal L1 Rev 1. I ask all members of the Council to log out and log in again to e-delegate to avoid being logged out of the system for security reasons while the vote is taking place. Please note that your vote will appear on the screen after a delay of 4 to 6 seconds. I now ask the Secretariat to activate the vote, and I ask all delegations to register their vote. For the information of all delegations, one delegation is trying to vote and is trying to log in again. I ask for your patience, please. Could all the delegations please ensure that your votes are accurately reflected on the screen? If so, I will ask the Secretariat to close the vote. The voting is now closed. The results of the recorded votes are as follows: 22 in favor, 11 against, 14 abstentions. Draft proposal L1 Rev 1 is therefore adopted. Copies of the results of the votes will shortly be uploaded on the extranet. Yes, we will now take a short technical break for 3 minutes. I ask all delegations please to stay online. Thank you. I hereby close the 47th meeting of the 46th session of the Human Rights Council. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby open the 48th meeting of the 46th session of the Human Rights Council. We will now continue to take action on draft resolutions, and the Council will now consider draft resolution L8 entitled Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in Nicaragua. I give the floor to the representative of Colombia to introduce the draft text by video statement.
President, I am making this statement on behalf of Brazil, Canada, Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, and my own country, Colombia, the sponsors of draft resolution L46/7 entitled Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in Nicaragua, which was submitted under agenda item 2. Almost 3 years have gone by since one of the most serious socio-political and human rights crises in America started. Since then, this council, through decisions 40 and 43/2, has ascertained firsthand the progressive deterioration of the human rights situation in Nicaragua, a situation which has been further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and natural disasters. The latest report by the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights, which was presented during this 46th session, gives an account of the human rights violations that continue to be committed in Nicaragua. The report also reflects the silence and the zero cooperation with human rights mechanisms and the non-existent political dialogue by those who, for more than 14 years now, have controlled the Nicaraguan state. 49 delegations are co-sponsoring our effort to contribute to a solution to this difficult situation in Nicaragua. President, this council has a mandate to and a moral obligation to seek to use all those tools available to it in order to protect and promote human rights. Therefore, the draft resolution calls on the Nicaraguan government to act in good faith and to cooperate with regional and international human rights mechanisms and to accept without delay humanitarian assistance. The draft resolution calls on this Central American state to take steps to ensure the application and exercise of democracy by the people of Nicaragua. We call for an end to the serious human rights violations there and to impunity. President, member states, ladies and gentlemen, for the reasons I have just mentioned, I invite everyone to adopt by consensus draft resolution L46/7 entitled Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in Nicaragua. Thank you very much.
I thank you. I have been informed by the Secretariat that there are 8 additional co-sponsors. I now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to make general comments. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU member states that are members of the Human Rights Council. This general comment has been agreed by the EU as a whole. We thank Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Peru for their leadership with respect to keeping Nicaragua on the agenda of the Human Rights Council. It is of concern to the EU that democracy, the rule of law, and human rights continue being undermined in Nicaragua, including by persistent restrictions on civic space and the state repression of dissent, which includes acts of intimidation, harassment, and unlawful or arbitrary detention and surveillance of political opponents, demonstrators, journalists, and civil society. The EU shares the grave concern expressed in L8 about recent legislative and constitutional reforms that further disregard civil and political rights and the lack of accountability for past and ongoing violations and abuses. We call on Nicaragua to cooperate with the regional and international human rights systems, including to implement the recommendations put forward by the OHCHR. The EU urges the government to enter into an urgent and inclusive dialogue on electoral reforms with the Nicaraguan opposition, including the various national organizations and political parties that have presented electoral reform proposals aimed at guaranteeing fair and transparent elections and to fulfill its commitments taken in agreement with the opposition in March 2019. This is an essential step to restore trust, and we stand ready to engage constructively and work together with the government towards a peaceful and democratic way out of the ongoing crisis. Human rights are fundamental to peaceful, inclusive, and just societies. The EU stresses that the continued reports of torture, arbitrary detentions, increased violence against women and girls and indigenous peoples, and the prevailing impunity in Nicaragua speak to the need for continued monitoring by this country. For all the reasons reflected above, the EU member states that are members of the Council will vote yes, and we call on the future membership, on the full membership of the Council to join the call on Nicaragua to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights in line with its obligations under international law. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other requests for the floor to make general comments? I see none. We shall now hear from the concerned country. Or to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua.
For the government of Venezuela, but also the governments of Cuba and Nicaragua. The pre-coup attempt and post-attempt have been accompanied by a campaign of fake news and disinformation of Goebbelsian big lie proportions that repeated thousands of times become a media fact, no matter how far from reality they may be. This type of campaign is very common these days in the media and social media, but it is unfortunate to see it in human rights reports, weaponized in favor of coup plotters who seek to disrupt democratic institutions. We denounce this proposal as politicized, and if approved, it will politicize this council. The resolution is based on the big lie about Nicaragua and is a faithful copy of the narrative and fictitious positions of the coup plotters, making this council an accomplice that distributes punishment from the so-called international powers. Therefore, Nicaragua hereby expresses its non-acceptance and absolute rejection of this proposal that constitutes an aggression against the people of Nicaragua.
I thank you. I have been informed by the Secretariat that there are PBIs in the sum of $421,500 for this draft proposal. Copies of the statement were posted on the extranet. I now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to make explanations of votes before the vote on the draft proposal. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. We reject in vehement terms draft resolution L.8. This initiative is a clear interference in the internal affairs of the Republic of Nicaragua. It is unacceptable that this council continues to be used as a tool for politicization, following the agenda of some powers and their regional allies who seek to destabilize sovereign nations. This draft resolution pursues the same objective of those groups which in 2018 sought to destabilize through violence the government of National Reconciliation and Unity of Nicaragua. It also reflects support for extremist factions operating outside the country and which have historically shown that they have no interest in the well-being or progress for Nicaraguan citizens. We call on the member states of this council to reject draft resolution L.8, the text of which is completely imbalanced and the content of which shows no sign of contributing to Nicaragua's development. On the contrary, this draft resolution aims to discredit a sovereign state that lives in full democracy, peace, and continuous development. The initiative submitted full of subjective appraisals and considerations that are partial, incomplete, and misrepresentative, and they create a scenario that only exists in the minds of those countries that promote it. It's removed from the real situation of human rights in Nicaragua. Nicaragua has rejected this draft resolution as being inadmissible and arbitrary. It is a total denial of Nicaragua's independence and sovereignty and proposes an illicit intervention into the internal affairs of the country, aiming to reduce Nicaragua to some kind of protectorate of the sponsoring countries. The homeland of Sandino is an example of national dignity, which throughout its history has demonstrated bravery in the face of imperial sieges. For these reasons, Venezuela calls for a recorded vote by this council, and we will vote against draft resolution L.8, and we urge member states to do the same and to oppose this interventionist initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President. Any even slightly remoted observer who knows a little about the situation of human rights in Central America, including when it comes to security, organized crime, migration, socioeconomic situations, sociopolitical situations, public health situations, amongst other things, can swiftly reach the conclusion that isolating Nicaragua through a resolution is a politically motivated decision. Such an observer would also conclude that when it comes to certain matters, this council lives in a bubble, which is far removed from reality and from common sense. Cuba would like to reiterate its unwavering support for the Nicaraguan government and people in their firm decision to preserve peace and social, economic, security, progress and headway towards national unity. We reject the interventionist and meddling policy promoted against the sovereignty, self-determination and constitutional order of Nicaragua. Constructive dialogue with states needs to be at the heart of the work of the Office of the High Commissioner, and it should guide the work of its staff. The Office of the High Commissioner needs to critically self-assess its work vis-à-vis Nicaragua. Cooperation on the ground with human rights mechanisms and the office is something that is done upon request by states, and states can end such cooperation when they deem that fit. President, Cuba rejects draft resolution L8, and therefore we will vote against it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Thank you, President. My delegation will vote in favor of draft resolution L8 in representation of our concern at the human rights situation prevailing in Nicaragua. We'd like to thank the sponsors of the text, which reflects the comments, proposals, and input put forward by various countries during the informal consultation process. We believe that, generally speaking, this draft resolution does bring together various sources of concern that were duly captured in the report of the Office of the High Commissioner, issues which deserve the attention and the follow-up of this Human Rights Council. That said, we do believe that certain aspects of the draft could lead to confusion and could have benefited from greater clarity, such as, for example, the calls for legislative reform to be enacted. It would have been desirable for the text to reflect the degree of cooperation that exists between the Nicaraguan government and various agencies of the United Nations to address the COVID-19 emergency and the aftermath of those hurricanes which had such a serious impact on this country. As far as Mexico is concerned, it is vital that we continue to promote constructive dialogue with the Nicaraguan authorities in order to encourage them to resume the path towards cooperation and collaboration with international organizations. Where we have a text which duly and reflects in a balanced way the principal issues of concern, and which emphasizes and underscores the recommendations which should be acted upon, it will be easier to reach understanding. We launch a respectful appeal to the penholders of this initiative and the Nicaraguan authorities to maintain open channels of communication in order to ensure that this, our brother country, can overcome the challenges with which it is confronted with the support and cooperation of the international community, and to do so with full respect for sovereignty and for the Charter of the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
President, this draft resolution is biased and not aimed at improving the human rights situation in Nicaragua, but at unpicking the political situation in the country. And this is a blatant case of interference in the sovereign matters of a state. We regret that once again, this method of accusation has been resorted to. It has no prospects, and it has been resorted to instead of constructive dialogue. The attempts by some states to worsen the situation in the country and encourage unrest there and use unilateral coercive measures to exert pressure on Nicaragua would be counterproductive. We believe that the problems in the field of human rights need to be discussed exclusively on a mutually beneficial and equal basis without any interference from outside. Once again, sadly, we are forced to note that a political consideration of the Nicaraguan situation discredits the work of the Council. In essence, it is a waste of resources which the UN as a whole and the Council in particular need, given the tense budgetary situation. The Russian Federation will vote against this draft resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Argentina.
Thank you, President.
República Argentina desea reiterar su oposición a las medidas coercitivas unilaterales.
We would like to reiterate our opposition to unilateral coercive measures and sanctions, in particular those that have a direct impact on enjoyment of human rights, particularly economic, social, and cultural human rights. and all the more so in one of the poorest countries in Latin America, such as Nicaragua. We'd also like to voice our support for the work of the OHCHR, as we always do. Through the reports of the OHCHR, it's been able to shed a light on the human rights situation in Nicaragua, particularly the report submitted in February. The government of this country has recently demonstrated an openness to cooperation with specialized agencies of the United Nations in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the aftermath of hurricanes in the country. It is also urgent that this country extend this cooperation to all mechanisms of the organization, in particular the OHCHR. And this country is also urgently called upon to implement all of the recommendations made by the OHCHR in its report. In light of the aforementioned, we will vote in favor of the aforementioned resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Czech Republic. I would like to inform the Council that the Czech Republic has withdrawn its co-sponsorship for this draft resolution. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. The Czech Republic thanks the core group for presenting the draft resolution L8 entitled Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in Nicaragua. We are concerned about the continuing human rights violations and abuses in Nicaragua, including persisting restrictions on the civic space and oppressions of dissent, intimidation, harassment, and arbitrary detention and surveillance of human rights defenders, journalists and media workers, students and individuals expressing critical views of the government. The lack of accountability since 2018, reports of torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, and increase of sexual and gender-based violence in detentions are alarming. The resolution L8 before us today addresses the serious human rights situations in Nicaragua in a comprehensive and balanced way. It requests the High Commissioner for Human Rights to enhance and broaden the monitoring by her office and to continue reporting on the situation, including close monitoring on the situation in the context of the electoral process. Madam President, the serious human rights violations and prevailing impunity in Nicaragua speak to the need for continued monitoring of the situation. For the reasons stated above, the Czech Republic strongly supports the resolution L8, Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in Nicaragua. We will vote yes on the resolution and call on all members of this Council to do likewise. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the United Kingdom. I would like to inform the Council that the United Kingdom has withdrawn its co-sponsorship for this draft resolution. The United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. The UK will vote in favour of Resolution L8 entitled Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in Nicaragua. We stand in full support with the countries of Brazil, Chile, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Peru, the main sponsors of this resolution. The High Commissioner's most recent report documents the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in Nicaragua. We note her findings highlighting the increasing restrictions on civic space and political rights, the continued use of arbitrary detention, the harassment and intimidation of human rights defenders and journalists, and a number of concerning pieces of legislation which undermine freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. The UK considers that the Council has a duty to respond to this ongoing human rights crisis. Madam President, the arguments used against this resolution, that it is politicised, that it is selective, or even outright denials of the many very serious allegations of human rights violations and abuses in Nicaragua, are not credible. We take no side in the politics of Nicaragua, but hundreds are now dead, thousands injured, and many political prisoners still languish in detention centres. The perpetrators of the crackdown in 2018 have still not been held to account. This resolution is both warranted and also much needed. The UK considers that OHCHR monitoring and reporting is vital in the lead up to Nicaragua's presidential elections in November 2021. We call upon the Nicaraguan government to cooperate fully with UN investigations and regional human rights mechanisms. This resolution, which maintains international scrutiny and pressure, paves the way towards improving the human rights situation for all Nicaraguans. We urge all members of the Council to vote in favour of this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. And are there any other delegations requesting the floor for explanation of vote before the vote? I see none. At the request of the delegation of Venezuela, the Council will now proceed to a recorded vote on draft proposal L8, and I ask all members of the Council to log out and log in again to e-delegate to avoid being logged out of the system for security reasons while the vote is taking place. Please note that your vote will appear on the screen after a delay of 4 to 6 seconds. I now ask the Secretariat to activate the vote, and I ask all delegations to register their vote. Delegations may wish to click on the refresh button on the top left-hand side of the screen in case the draft proposal does not appear immediately on the screen. Okay. Put it here. Put it on the table. I don't know. That's the screen sharing.
If they are logging out, we have to wait.
Yeah, that's okay. I can see the screen. I ask for all delegations to bear with us, please. We are just waiting for one delegation to vote. I ask that all delegations ensure that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen. And if so, I will ask the Secretariat to close the vote. The voting is now closed. The results of the recorded votes are as follows: 20 in favor, 8 against, 18 abstentions. Proposal L therefore adopted. Copies of the results of the votes will shortly be uploaded on the extranet. The Council will now consider draft resolution L31 entitled The Human Rights Situation in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem, and the obligation to ensure accountability and justice. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan on behalf of the OIC to introduce the draft text. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. On behalf of the OIC member states and co-sponsors, Pakistan presents the draft resolution entitled Human Rights Situation in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem, and the obligation to ensure accountability and justice as contained in document A/HRC/46/L31. In the spirit of constructive engagement and efficiency demonstrated by the State of Palestine and the OIC member states, we this year have merged the two texts on ensuring accountability and human rights situation. The objective of the draft resolution is to shed light on the deteriorating situation characterized by grim and grave human rights violations and lack of accountability in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. For this, the resolution recalls all reports, including fact-finding missions and commission of inquiries reports, and emphasizes the importance of implementing recommendations contained therein. It is indeed imperative to end impunity for violations of international law in the OPT. Madam President, the preambular part of the resolution recalls relevant rules and principles of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, in particular, the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war, which is applicable to the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. It reaffirms the obligation to ensure the protection of civilians in armed conflict. It also expresses deep concerns over the critical human rights and humanitarian conditions of the Palestinian civilian population in the Gaza Strip. The operative part of the draft resolution demands that all practices and actions that violate the human rights of the Palestinian people should cease. It reaffirms the core principles and rules of international law in this regard and demands that Israel should comply with the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention and with its legal obligations under international human rights law, including in times of pandemic, and ensure the non-discriminatory access to COVID vaccines. The resolution also calls upon all states to promote compliance with their human rights obligations. It further calls on all high contracting parties to the Fourth Geneva Convention to respect and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law in the OPT, including East Jerusalem, in accordance with Article 1, common to the Geneva Conventions, and to fulfill their obligations under Articles 146, 147, and 148 of the Convention. As this resolution calls for upholding the human rights and ensuring accountability for violations of international law, we hope the Council members would join consensus by adopting this resolution. I thank you.
Thank you. And I have been informed by the Secretariat that there are 8 additional co-sponsors. I now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to make general comments. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU member states that are members of the Human Rights Council. This general comment has been agreed by the EU as a whole. We wish to thank the Mission of Palestine for its engagement and efforts on this and other resolutions. We welcome the choice to present this merged text under item 2, thus reducing the overall number of resolutions and taking into account our principal position on item 7. We recognize the considerable effort made by the Palestinian mission, and we look forward to continue engaging with them in a positive spirit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other delegations requesting the floor to make general comments? I see none. We shall now hear from the concerned countries, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Israel. You have the floor.
Madam President, this resolution may be presented under item 2 but it still contains the same one-sided, distorted understanding of the situation on the ground, like its item 7 predecessors. When I look through this resolution, I'm amazed that members of this council can ever consider this a fair and balanced resolution. It does not reflect the reality on the ground, and if anything, this resolution will contribute to the polarization of the conflict. Madam President, how can this resolution reflect the reality on the ground when Hamas is not mentioned? Hamas is a terrorist organization that is responsible for the most abhorrent human rights abuses against Israelis and Palestinians alike. In fact, to reflect the absurdity of this resolution, it only mentions terrorism and incitement when condemning Israel and does not attribute any responsibility to Palestinian actors. How can this resolution reflect the reality on the ground without mentioning the 100,000 trucks which entered Gaza from Israel carrying food, fuels, and more over the past year, or without mentioning the more than 2,000 tons of textiles worth 65 million shekels exported from Gaza last year? How can this resolution reflect the reality on the ground without mentioning the 140,000 medical permits given to Palestinians to be treated in Israel, including 13,000 children? How can it reflect reality without mentioning that it is the Palestinian Authority responsibility to vaccinate its own people, and that despite this, Israel has facilitated the vaccine against COVID-19 for over 100,000 Palestinian workers? How can this resolution not mention the positive cooperation between Israel and the PA in facing the pandemic throughout the past year? Madam President, this resolution does not reflect the reality on the ground because this is not the purpose of it. Its purpose is not to ensure accountability and justice, nor to objectively assess the human rights situation. The sole purpose of this resolution by those who wrote it and those who support it is to negate Israel. It's to paint a picture, to tell a story, which the Palestinians continues to tell, one that does not reflect the reality. Madam President, any member state who votes in favor of this resolution and backs its narrative cannot be an honest broker when it comes to peace in the Middle East. Voting for this resolution is voting for a one-sided narrative with the sole purpose of negating my country, while understanding that it has no impact on the ground. Therefore, I call on member states of this council to vote no to this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the State of Palestine. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Pakistan, the coordinator of the Islamic group. I would also like to thank the mission of the European Union and those who sponsored the resolution on the situation of human rights in the OPT, including East Jerusalem, and the obligation to ensure accountability and justice. This resolution comes in the context of the international obligation of the universal jurisdictions as a tool to ensure preventing grave violations of IHL and the international human rights law and the international customary law. The mission of Palestine this year has proceeded to consolidate the resolutions of the human rights situation and accountability. We are amazed as when we approach item 7, it would be said that Israel is being singled out. And when we approach the ICC for justice, some would reject that on the grounds that Palestine is not recognized as a state. This is indeed another sin perpetrated by these states. When we approach item 2, when we reduce the number of resolutions taken into consideration or remarks and amendments with a view to reaching a consensual format, some of the countries that would vote or abstain from voting on this resolution would increase. This leads us to emphasize that these countries should not at all call for accountability in any part of the world, given its duality, given the politicization that they use while we are speaking about the principle of accountability. The issue of Palestine is an issue of foreign occupation for over 45 years. The idea of accountability, remedy, and reparation should be a consensual matter for all countries. It is a precondition to consolidate non-impunity, and this is connected with the implementation of law through national and international legal mechanisms, in addition to the obligations of the high contracting countries to take deterring practical steps as per Articles 146, 147, 148 of Geneva Conventions, the fourth Geneva Convention. We also call for the implementation of the recommendations and conclusions of the fact-finding missions sent by your council, your August Council, since 2006, as well as the outcome of the high contracting Party Summit held in 2014. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I have been informed by the Secretariat that there are no PBIs for this draft proposal. I now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to make explanations of votes before the vote on the draft proposal. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
President, Brazil firmly believes a comprehensive Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement ensuring a fair and equitable solution acceptable to both sides remains an attainable and desirable goal. We stand ready to engage in constructive dialogue with all concerned parties. Respect for international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law is the cornerstone for peace and security in the region. Brazil reiterates its support to the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people in accordance with international law. We welcome the decision by the Palestinian delegation at the present session to further reduce the number of initiatives presented under item 7 of the agenda. Brazil considers it important that the Council continue to monitor the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. On the other hand, we regret key aspects of the combined text on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, accountability and justice, L31. It remains profoundly unbalanced, partial and biased. It continues to single out Israel for wrongdoing while essentially ignoring violations of human rights by other parties. The issues of accountability and international criminal justice seem to be misplaced and misconstrued in the text. Likewise, references on possible war crimes and crimes against humanity have no place in a resolution that should focus on reporting by the High Commissioner on Human Rights. For such reasons, Brazil requests a vote on the resolution on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and the obligation to ensure accountability and justice. Brazil will vote against the resolution. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Today, the Council considers this resolution on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and the obligation to ensure accountability and justice. It will do so under an agenda item that does not discriminate between nations. The United Kingdom strongly welcomes the Palestinian decision to move another resolution from item 7 and to merge it with the accountability resolution that has been considered under item 2 since 2019. Because this merged human rights and accountability resolution is not under item 7, the United Kingdom has been able to engage in negotiations and consider it on its merits. The United Kingdom welcomes the condemnation in this text of rocket fire from Gaza into Israel. We strongly condemn the indiscriminate firing of rockets by Hamas and other militant groups. We are resolute in our commitment to Israel's security. We welcome the recognition of Israel's legitimate security considerations in this text. These have been long-standing UK asks that increase the balance in the text. Over the past year, we've seen high numbers of demolitions and evictions across the West Bank and significant settlement advancement by the government of Israel, including in sensitive locations around East Jerusalem. We continue to be concerned by the treatment of Palestinian minors in Israeli military detention and by accusations of excessive use of force by the Israeli Defense Forces. The UN and its member states should address these serious matters in a measured and proportionate manner. Ultimately, Madam President, a solution to this long-standing conflict requires appropriate scrutiny of all parties. Despite positive moves, the United Kingdom's view is that the resolution put before the Council today should address more fully the conduct of Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza, particularly Hamas's treatment of the Palestinian population of Gaza, including on issues such as freedom of expression. On that basis, we will abstain. The UK also stresses that it does not recognise the state of Palestine or references thereto in this resolution. The United Kingdom will continue to call for scrutiny of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, and we reiterate our support for the positive steps taken by the Palestinian delegation to tackle our concerns around item 7. Madam President, let me end by restating the UK support for a two-state solution that ends the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay. You have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Uruguay, once again, reiterates its support for the two-state solution, sharing the space with internationally recognized borders. At the same time, we should like to reiterate the importance of renewing the commitment, perpetuating a dialogue as a path to find a peaceful solution to the conflict in Israel and Palestine. To do this, it is vital to have a cessation to violence on all sides, and their full commitment to international human rights standards and international humanitarian law. Uruguay remains concerned at the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories and expresses its rejection of the violations documented by the High Commissioner. In turn, Uruguay wishes to reaffirm its support to the legitimate right to Israel of self-defense and its existence within safe, internationally recognized borders in peaceful coexistence with their neighbors, echoing the concern noted in the High Commissioner's report on the indiscriminate launching of rockets and missiles by armed groups against that country. At the same time, Uruguay reiterates its concern on the disproportionate use of force in the Gaza Strip and its impact on the civilian populations, in particular children. Uruguay wishes to recognize the sponsors of Resolution L31 and thank them for their flexibility in merging two resolutions into one single initiative. This effort is in line with our country's position in that the accountability issue must be included in one of the previously existing resolutions. At the same time, Uruguay notes positively that this resolution has been submitted under item 2 of the Council's agenda and recognizes the need that for the human rights situation in the OPT be analysed on an equal footing with other country situations. Therefore, Uruguay will vote in favour of draft resolution L31. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Before the vote, I would like to explain our position. Japan supports the integration of resolutions from the perspective of rationalization of the Human Rights Council resolutions. We encourage further streamlining of the rest of the resolutions under item 7. At the same time, Japan's stance on the issue of human rights in Palestine, as well as its position on the occupied territories, remain the same. The Human Rights Council has an important role to play in responding effectively to the crises and dire human rights violations witnessed in various places around the world, and protecting and promoting the human rights of all people. Japan has long made efforts to contribute to realizing peace in the Middle East and will continue to do so. We hope the Council will play a conducive role to this end. In this regard, Japan will vote in favor of the resolution. I thank you.
Thank you. And are there any other delegations which wish to speak at this stage on explanation of vote before the vote? I see none. At the request of the delegation of Brazil, the Council will now proceed to a recorded vote on draft proposal L13. I again ask all members of the Council to log out and log in again to eDelegate to avoid being logged out during the voting process. I now ask the Secretariat to activate the vote, and I ask all delegations to register their vote. I remind delegations to click on the refresh button on the top left-hand side of the screen if the draft proposal does not appear on your screen. I request all delegations to ensure that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen. And if so, I will ask the Secretariat to close the vote. The voting is now closed. The results of the recorded votes are as follows: 32 in favor, 6 against, and 8 abstentions. Draft proposal 31 is therefore adopted. Copies of the results of the votes will shortly be uploaded on the extranet. We will now move to explanations of vote and general comments after the vote on all resolutions adopted under Agenda Item 2. And I understand that the delegation of Indonesia would like to take the floor. You have the floor.
Madam President, we have closely followed the discussions on the draft resolution L1 Ref 1 on promoting reconciliations, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka. We appreciate the continued and active engagement of the permanent representative of Sri Lanka during the informal negotiations. Such engagement shows the willingness and determination of the government of Sri Lanka to provide comments, explanations, and amendments to the draft, as well as in advancing dialogue with the core group. Indonesia values such engagement. Moreover, we have benefited from the explanation provided by the Sri Lankan delegations during the negotiations, particularly with regards to the efforts and challenges in the promotion and protection of human rights on the ground. We support efforts to further respect and protect human rights in Sri Lanka to be more inclusive. At this juncture, we are reminded that the Council resolutions has to provide solutions on the ground. For the resolution to be successfully implemented, engagement with the country concerned is imperative. We regret that there is no consensus on the draft. Indeed, the Council could extend its expertise to further support the promotion and reconciliations, accountability, and human rights in the country concerned. Hence, my delegation would like to emphasize that the Council should abide by its principles, namely that the promotion and protection of human rights must be based on the principle of cooperation and genuine dialogue and aim at strengthening the capacity of member states. Furthermore, all countries, including Sri Lanka, has their human rights obligations to fulfill the benefit of all human beings, including the UPR recommendations they accepted. Therefore, we voted abstain on the draft resolution L1 Ref 1 on promoting reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. With regard to the draft resolution L1 Rev 1, the Republic of Korea voted in favor. In addition, I would like to provide the following explanations. The Republic of Korea notes with appreciation that the government of Sri Lanka has engaged in various efforts to promote national reconstruction and prosperity. We also acknowledge the government of Sri Lanka's progress in its commitment and contribution in the field of rebuilding infrastructure, demining, resettling internally displaced persons, and rehabilitating former child soldiers after the devastating conflict. We note that Sri Lanka successfully held the presidential election in November 2019, followed by the general election in August 2020 in a transparent and democratic manner. The Republic of Korea welcomes the government of Sri Lanka's reaffirmation of its engagement with the UN system and the UN human rights mechanisms. We trust that the government of Sri Lanka will achieve further advances in reconstruction, reconciliation, and accountability at the earliest possible time. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation would like to deliver this statement of explanation of vote with regard to the draft resolution L1 Rev 1 promoting reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka. Madam President, we value the work and contribution of the UN human rights system towards the universal respect of human rights. We would also like to reiterate that Nepal's own experience tells us that when conflict transformation and peace process is homegrown, nationally led, and owned, as well as based on the ground realities, the chances of its success remain high. We view that in the context of promoting reconciliation, accountability, human rights, and lasting peace in Sri Lanka, these aspects need to be given due consideration. In this line, we expected consensus on the draft resolution as it was achieved in the earlier resolutions on Sri Lanka. We expected that the concerns of country concerned would be taken into account and they would be brought on board, which would ensure the effective implementation of the resolution. But this did not happen. So we voted abstention. I thank you.
Thank you. And are there any other requests for the floor for explanations of votes or general comments after the vote? I see none. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this meeting. We will resume in 30 minutes to continue taking action on draft resolutions. I wish to invite those observer states who will introduce draft proposals under Agenda Item 3 to log into the Zoom meeting during this break. Those observer states who are currently present in Zoom under Agenda Item 2 are asked to please exit this Zoom meeting. Thank you. We will resume in 30 minutes.